We are back. Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the Auburn Undercover Podcast here on the 24/7 Sports Network. My name is Nathan King. This is the A-Day edition of the podcast. 2021 A-Day spring game for Auburn is obviously in the books. Pretty exciting weekend considering we were deprived of this game last year. This was kind of during the height of the COVID lockdowns and everything shutting down in sports across the country last April. Auburn spring practice obviously didn't happen, so we didn't get the A-Day game last year. So we had the first one since 2019 on Saturday, and obviously the debut of Bryan Harsin's team inside Jordan-Hare Stadium. They've already been in Jordan-Hare in front of some fans for some open scrimmages and stuff, but obviously not in a game simulation type setting like we had on Saturday. The final score of the game, which obviously you can't really look much into pretty much anything that happened in this game, especially negatives. I don't really think you can draw much from a negative. I think you can only look at the positives and look at what you can possibly learn. But it was 17-3, a little bit different than years past. In years past, you had Team Blue and Team White. This year it was Team Auburn and Team Tigers. Team Auburn won 17-3. Team Auburn was mostly the starters. It was mostly the first team offense and the first team defense, whereas Team Tigers was the second team offense, second team defense. And as the game went on, obviously guys were kind of substituted out a little bit more, and it became more of the third teamers versus the fourth teamers, that kind of thing. But I thought it was funny. I mean, I think there was a little bit of a discrepancy between what Auburn and the players and Bryan Harsin, the people actually on the team personnel, thought of what their teams were called and what Auburn wanted to present them as, because after the game, Harsin and all the players sort of referred to their team as, Team Blue did some good things. Yeah, Blue moved the ball here pretty well. White made some plays. So they were referring to it as Blue and White. And for some reason, Auburn decided for it to be Auburn and Tigers. I don't really know how that happened. But anyway, yes, of course, a super fun day inside Jordan-Hare Stadium. Want to get into everything that happened. Number one, if you weren't able to watch the game, I mean, I know it was kind of a difficult watch. You had to be streaming on the ESPN app. It was on SEC Network Alternate. This was the first time in a while that the game hasn't just been televised on normal TV. Normally, it's just on SEC Network, but there were 7 SEC spring games this weekend. So obviously, it was going to be difficult to slot everybody in there. I will say that Auburn had an attendance of 25,210 fans is what they officially clocked it as. Obviously, that's bigger than what they had in the fall. In the fall, they capped out at 17,490, and that was at 20% capacity. They were able, because of some COVID strides that we're making, obviously, they were able to move things up to 40% capacity. That was the second biggest attendance of the day. And obviously I'm not 100% sure about everybody's policies. Obviously different stadiums and different programs had different guidelines for their spring games, but there were 7 games, and Georgia and LSU also played. Arkansas, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, and Auburn had the second biggest behind Alabama, which I'm pretty sure Alabama just maxed out their capacity, which that's going to happen with that program. So a pretty good turnout, I think, all things considered, for Auburn. I know some people were talking about how they didn't reach the 40% capacity. They didn't max it out inside the stadium, but I'm like, I mean, just when you consider all things, that was pretty good for Auburn to get that many people in the stadium. So wanted to just overview things and then, kind of take a closer look at things. It's kind of hard. I think an A-Day, as a spring game, no matter where you are, is a little bit more difficult than even a normal game to glean and to break things down as they're happening, because you're not 100% sure about who's doing what and what kind of roles players are in, as opposed to a normal season where you've understood this team by now. What kind of plays they're running, where guys are supposed to be, how players are developing within the offense and defense. You can kind of understand whether there are screw ups, whether there are successes, that kind of thing. But in a spring game, things run really fast. The second half, a lot of it was a moving clock. It was 8-minute quarters, 4 8-minute quarters. I was actually pretty happy with the way that they turned it into a game simulation. I thought that Bryan Harsin might make this a little bit more of a glorified practice session and have a lot more situational work, but really there wasn't that much situational stuff. The kickoff teams were not live, so return men were just encouraged to finish out the play and run it back And people people weren't 100% sure about that at the beginning because Tank Bigsby, quote, ran the opening kickback for a touchdown, end quote. But and then people got on their feet for that. They thought he was returning it to the house. The broadcast said to the house on the bottom, but then as they realized that every single return man was asked to take it back and they weren't going to be tackled, they were like, oh, okay, we didn't actually return it for a touchdown. But other than that, it was pretty much offense versus defense, 11 on 11, in a pretty normal game setting. There was one drive right before halftime where Carlson put the second team offense, so Team Tigers. I think Grant Loy was still in at quarterback at that point, put them in a 2-minute drill situation, and that is the only time they scored. I don't really think they would have scored again just because them going up against that first team defense was not really fair. Guys were just getting absolutely locked down. The second team offense went 3 and out their first 3 drives of the game, but Carlson put them at the 35-yard line, the opposing 35-yard line with, I think about 35 seconds to go. And they were able to move the ball a little bit. Anders Carlson obviously was 2 of 2 on field goals for the day. So we'll just get right into it. We'll break down everything that happens, all the little tidbits, what we learned about individual players and schemes, and how coaches are going to use their offenses and defenses, and kind of look ahead to what some of this stuff that we saw means. So there were a few interesting notes that we made pregame, just kind of observing everything. First of all, there were 5 guys that were there and did not dress out. So this is all kind of on the injury front. None of them, only one of them really a surprise, I think. So JJ Evans, who tweaked his hamstring in the open practice at the beginning of spring camp, kind of hobbled off the field. He did not dress out. Brandon Council, who has not dressed out all spring, offensive lineman, not a surprise. Daniel Foster Allen, who's a defensive end, a redshirt freshman, came in last year. He's been dealing with an injury for a while, so he has been a participant in practice recently, and for most of spring he was, but I think it's probably just an issue with that injury flaring back up and them not wanting to risk it. Then obviously Jeremiah Wright, the defensive tackle, who was having a good start to the spring, good first week and a half or so, 2 weeks before he tore his ACL. Obviously, you're not going to have him available. And then a guy I was really excited to see, so that's kind of unfortunate, Cam Riley, the sophomore linebacker, who's kind of been Auburn's number 4 linebacker right now behind those 3 veterans, Zacoby McClano and Papo Chandler Wooten. You were going to have one guy after those, and it's been Cam Riley, who's now 6'5", 209 pounds, lots of athleticism, obviously a really interesting build. It's kind of a frame that your coaching staff can mold. I was interested to see what he was going to do, because when we talked to the assistant coaches, Jeff Schmedding, the new linebackers coach, sort of insinuated that he might be able to bounce between inside and outside linebacker. He did that a little bit last year, but obviously we weren't able to see him, and he hadn't had an injury previously in spring. He hadn't been dealing with anything, so hopefully he'll be able to get back soon. Not sure what that injury was, but so those were the guys who did not play, who were not dressed out but were present. 4 players did play, but they were in non-contact jerseys. Shedrick Jackson, the wide receiver, the senior, who's been dealing with an injury all spring. Desmond Tisdall and Amari Harvey. Desmond Tisdall, linebacker. Amari Harvey, the freshman safety. Both those guys have been in those non-contact jerseys at every practice that we've been able to see. And then Zion Puckett, the nickelback, third-year player, that was a good sign for him to be, I guess, elevated to non-contact jersey status, because he's been sort of limited off to the side, not really participating in a lot of stuff, but now he was able to participate a little bit more. I don't think Shed Jackson got in the game. I never saw a yellow jersey at receiver or his number 11. I don't think he checked into the game. Looking now, I don't see any targets for him or anything like that. And then there were a lot of players actually not there. And this was probably, in terms of personnel, just looking at guys and injuries and stuff like that, this was probably the most concerning part of the day, I guess, and the most interesting part of the day. Because when you think about it, this is a practice session, and this is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, of the spring. Well, maybe not the biggest. Coaching staff would obviously have to decide that, but it is a scrimmage, and it's in front of a lot of fans, and it's an opportunity to put things together after 4 weeks of practice. Obviously, Auburn's got one more day of practice on Monday, recording this on Sunday. They got one more day to make up for a day that was lost by weather earlier in the spring. Anyway, it's not normal to have 6 guys if it wasn't 2021. Just spring games in the past, 6 guys not at the spring game, you'd be like, okay, what's the deal? But now that we've got, COVID added to the mix, Brian Harsin did say earlier this spring that they've had a few cases, that they've done a good job of it overall, which has been apparent from the way that the team has looked. I mean, there hasn't been position groups crippled or anything like that, or a ton of guys out at one time. This is not the first time people haven't been present at practice, but I'll just run down the list. Is Alec Jackson, the starting left tackle. So Austin Troxel was the starting LT for the game. Xavier Capers, the receiver who dealt with a foot injury and had surgery early in the offseason and was limited this spring. He was not there. Jay Hardy, who had an injury last season, was not present. Marco Domio, the JUCO cornerback, also who's had an injury this spring and been limited, not there. TD Moultrie, the defensive end or edge rusher now, the super senior, he also missed a open practice a couple weeks ago and was not present at that one, and there was no reason given for his absence there. And then defensive end, Jaron Handy, a guy that I was really looking forward to seeing in the spring game and seeing how he fit in Derek Mason's system and how they kind of utilized his skill set. So those 6 guys obviously not there. Again, I mean, you don't want to read too much into it, and that's what Brian Harsin said, is that, don't make it more than it is, because obviously there's a common, there's COVID issues across the country. Everybody's got them. Brian Harsin didn't shy away from saying that Auburn has had them this spring, but this is probably the only, and this is just, my opinion, doesn't really matter. My opinion doesn't matter at all, but this is probably the only, I think, misstep that Brian Harsin has made in terms of what he has talked about this spring, because I do think that if you had just addressed the situation and said something to the effect of, well, we have a combination of COVID issues, right now, a few guys with COVID, and then a few other guys who, for, personal respective reasons, respective to their individual situations, weren't able to be with us today. I don't know, something to that effect. But instead it was a very vague, beat around the bush answer for Brian Harsin, saying, these guys weren't able to participate in what we were doing today. They weren't able to do what we were doing today, but they're still on the team. And to me, I mean, I think if you just kind of shoot a lot straighter than that, you cut out all the speculation, because that's what a coaching staff wants. That's what a head coach wants. They don't like these kinds of situations, because they always talk about, don't pay attention to rumors and stuff like that. And I think you can eliminate a lot of that if you just shoot straighter than that. But instead, there was no answer given. And now essentially people are left to speculate. And some people would say, and I can see both sides. Some people would say, well, it's none of our business. People, somebody said something a while ago that made a lot of sense to me. What, have you never missed work before? And that's understandable. But again, a bit, 6 players, including, I mean, all of these guys were expected to play roles on the offense and the defense this year. All of them missing the spring game, I just kind of raised my eyebrows a little bit, and everybody kind of wondering what was going on, and we didn't really get an answer to it. So, but he did say, obviously everybody's still on the team. So again, no reason to speculate, moving forward. We'll see them next time Auburn practices, but which will be Monday, and we won't see that in person, but really no reason to be concerned about any of that. I'm just making the comments and making the observation that those were the guys not there. Okay, so jumping into the actual spring game action, I went back and rewatched the game. You can find it on YouTube. Auburn posted the highlights on their Twitter page, and I think everywhere else they posted their own highlights with Andy Burcham's call, but those are obviously just the highlights of the game. Not a lot of defensive highlights really in there, because there were a lot of plays made by a lot of different defenders on the first team, second team, third team that you're not going to see. So there is a full replay of it on YouTube if you just look up 2021 Auburn A-Day, because I know a lot of people had difficulty watching this game. So if you want to go back and watch it, you can do that. So watching the replay, and we'll kind of just break this down position by position. Watching the replay, I think Bo Nix had a better game than his stat line really showed, and that I think you kind of realized on first glance and kind of on face value for him. So he went 12 of 20 for a $112 and a touchdown. The touchdown, by the way, on a 3rd and goal, kind of a high degree of difficulty scramble. I think it was a designed rollout for Nix, hitting Elijah Canyon in the back of the end zone, and Canyon a lot of concentration to make the catch. And then as he was pulling it down, was hit by the safety as well while he was towing the back line of the end zone. So to me, I mean, Tank Bigsby had a 46-yard touchdown run. Those were your 2 touchdowns on the day, but Bigsby just had to really make one cut, and then he was galloping past that second team secondary because he's the best player on either side of the field. So to me, that Canyon play was probably one of, if not the most impressive offensive play of the game. Really, really good catch by him. And on a day where the receivers did make a lot of mistakes, Brian Harsin noted. But anyway, just in the passing game, I mean, just on the first drive, you saw a lot of under center. You saw a lot of what Mike Bobo has been talking about. It did look like a different Auburn offense in terms of the power running, utilizing the fullbacks, going 12 personnel. They were in 12 personnel a lot. There was a situation when they got into the red zone where they brought in 4 tight ends. So definitely a new look Auburn offense. And Bo Nix's first pass of the day, his first completion was over the middle, I think for 13 yards, something like that, to Tyler Fromm, the tight end. So that factor of the offense was definitely present. Him getting a little bit more check down ability and a little bit easier options of running backs caught passes as well. But Nix really only scrambled out of the pocket and had his, kind of standard stereotypical Bo Nix play, kind of, eliminating the play by scrambling out too much. He only did that once or twice, really, when you went back and looked at it. And there were actually a few plays where, look, he's in a non-contact jersey. If defenders close in on him and kind of just give him a little touch, he's going to technically be down. But there were a lot of plays where he started scrambling. And if he wasn't in a non-contact jersey, he would have picked up some heavy yardage. It reminded me of the LSU game last year. It reminded me of the Ole Miss game last year. And so it doesn't really seem like that athleticism for him and his ability to create outside the pocket, his escape ability is what Brian Harsin called it. It doesn't seem like that's going to be shied away from in this new offense. Harsin talked about it a lot after the game as something that really excites him, as Nix's athleticism excites him, as kind of a second degree of weapons that Bo Nix can use. Obviously, they want him to push the ball down the field and go through his reads well, but when that doesn't work, he's got one of the better athletes in the SEC at quarterback to be able to make plays. And so really in that regard, it was kind of a standard performance for Bo Nix, but I do think he made a lot of good reads. There were a few mistakes. The wide receivers, kind of touching on that now. This was a group that needed a lot of work in the spring, and Brian Harsin has said it now 2 or 3 times that this group hasn't come as far as they wanted to. Obviously, there are 3 injuries right now. 3 guys didn't play. Shedrick Jackson, JJ Evans, and Xavion Capers didn't play in this game, and they've been injured for most of the spring. And you're giving that injury bug to an already very, very inexperienced group that lost its top 3 pass catchers. Obviously, Anthony Schwartz, Eli Stove, Seth Williams lost all of those guys to the NFL. So it's a really talented room. I mean, in the 2020 class, they brought in 5 receivers, 4 of which were 4-star guys. And the only 3-star is Elijah Canyon, who is a starter right now and had a really big bowl game and definitely looks the part of a starter and probably is going to be a starter. So right now you've just got that situation for the receivers, and they haven't come along as far as Brian Harsin would want. He did admit that this is a group that gets a lot asked of them. They've got a brand new position coach, obviously very young, and they're being asked to not only implement this new offense and get comfortable with it and put in all these plays, but also at the same time develop their own skill sets and not be, such a young and inexperienced group and kind of, make people not look at them in that way and not make that something that teams are going to use against Auburn when the season rolls around. Obviously, Javarius Johnson, the 3rd-year player out of Hewitt-Trussville, he's had a really big spring. He's probably had the biggest spring out of anybody on offense. He had an opportunity to take over the slot receiver role and be one of Auburn's top 3 receivers this spring. Him, Kobe Hudson, and Elijah Canyon are kind of the top 3. He had a good game. He was the first punt returner to see the field, so that's something to note. He looks like he might have that job, which is not a surprise. He's a short, fast, shifty guy. Not only because he wears number 6, but he reminds me of just a lot of Christian Tutt, the previous punt returner, in that regard. So, but yeah, I mean, this is something where, and this is what me and Jason Caldwell were talking about a little bit after the game, I would not be surprised to see them go after a transfer This might be one of the positions on the roster where they look to bring in a transfer this offseason now that the spring is over, because you don't need a number one guy, right? You don't need to bring in an absolute killer on the outside, somebody who's going to, light things up and be a number one receiver, because you want to let all these guys develop. And like I said, you've got plenty of talent brought in over the past couple recruiting classes, and you want to let them develop and turn into great players. And I think a lot of these guys, they've all shown flashes. Obviously, Canyon had the flashes in the bowl game. I thought Capers and Kobe Hudson looked good and consistent last year, catching passes. I think Capers is a really, really good looking receiver. And then Javarius Johnson's had a really good spring. So you can let those guys develop and let them become the players you think they're going to be, still while bringing in like a junior or senior, a guy with 3 or 4 years of experience in this receiving core, telling him, hey, we need a consistent guy, a veteran who's going to be the number 2 or 3 guy to catch a lot of passes and to be consistent for our quarterback, because we don't have a lot of experienced options. So, but really on the whole, Bo Nix, I think, had a pretty good game. Again, the scrambles were probably the best aspect for him. He had an impressive 17-yard touchdown run that was called back because they ruled that he was touched at the 5. But, again, in a real game setting, you get touched at the 5, you're not going down. You're going to, barrel your way into the end zone, which is what he did before he got touched. There were 2 drops, which is not really a crazy number. I think people probably, if you watch the game as it happened, you probably thought there were more drops than that. I think there were just kind of some miscommunications, and that's what Harsin said, and Bo Nix kind of alluded to it. Harsin did not just allude to it. He was very transparent in saying that this receiving core didn't really help Bo Nix a lot. That Bo made the right reads, and Bo wanted to push the ball down the field to guys, and they just weren't in the right spot for him. They weren't making the right plays for him. They weren't adjusting as he was scrambling, which is something big that Brian Harsin and Mike Bobo both talked about. So yeah, obviously that's gonna hold you down a little bit. And they knew that was going to be a situation with these receivers in the spring, and they know that it's going to be an ongoing project moving into the summer and the fall. Bo Nix said he's excited to get with his receivers in the summer and just kind of sling the ball around on the grass and not really have the coaches there necessarily to mess with much of anything, and to just kind of get timing down. But so they had 2 drops, which is not a crazy number, but at the same time, when Bo Nix throws 20 passes, 10% drop rate, kind of on the whole, not really what you want to see. But the passing game, it did look a little bit different. A lot more emphasis, I think, on play action. And then you did have the under center stuff with more tight ends. Other than that, there were a lot of elements. And I think it's just because we know these players. There were a lot of elements from years past for Bo Nix. But that's okay. And obviously this isn't a finished product there on offense. But Brian Harsin did say, they were pleased with the way that the base offense was run. Obviously, the second and third team guys that were going against the starting defense really weren't able to get much going, but that was sort of to be expected. They know that the defense is something they're going to hang their hat on. It looks like this is going to be, I just don't see a situation where, again, unless these receivers just take a massive step and the offensive line ends up being way better than what we think it is, I don't see a way that this isn't a defensive-led team. Again, a team that's going to lean on its defense and probably produce a top 20, top 30, top 25 defense again, like it did every year under Kevin Steele. And that's just because the linebackers in the secondary on A-Day just looked so good. They just looked so much better than everybody else on the field. Every offensive player they went up against, talking about the starting linebackers, who are obviously really deep and really talented, really experienced. Jacoby McClain, Noah and Papo, 2 of the best in the SEC. And that secondary, under Derek Mason, we kind of got to see him showing off the versatility a little bit. You had Smoke Monday and Ladarius Tennyson back there at safety. Obviously, both of them looked really good. Nehemiah Pritchett is now playing nickel, so that gives you an opportunity to also put Roger McCreary and Jalen Simpson, who had a good game and is now completely healthy after kind of dealing with that nagging injury last year, had an opportunity to put all of them on the field. The defensive MVP came from the secondary, I will say. So the MVPs were Tank Bigsby on offense, who had the 46-yard touchdown run overall. He had 7 carries for 64 yards. They didn't give him too much burn, obviously. 9.1 yards per carry and a touchdown. That'll get the job done and give you MVP honors. The defensive MVP was Trey Elston. This is a guy who, local product, played at Auburn High School. He went to West Alabama and was a really productive player the 2019 season. He led the team in pass breakups as a kind of a safety nickel hybrid, and decided to come to Auburn. His brother, excuse me, or it might be his cousin, sorry, I don't want to mess this up, is Trey Elston, spelled differently, but he is a former NFL safety, a guy who played at Ole Miss. He was an All-American at Ole Miss and now plays safety in the NFL. Let me see if I can't find out whether it's his cousin or okay. Cousin Trey Elston played football for Ole Miss and the Buffalo Bills. So Elston, this is a guy that I'm actually kind of interested about after seeing him. I had noticed in some of our practice viewings that he was a guy that was getting a lot of looks from Derek Mason. Obviously, Derek Mason also coaches the safeties in addition to being the defensive coordinator. This is a guy that was getting looked at a lot by Derek Mason, getting a lot of work and getting in with the second team defense pretty often. And it was very apparent after A-Day that right now he's the team's number 4 safety. And I don't know how much of that has to do with Amari Harvey still being in that non-contact jersey. We knew safety was going to be thin until the fall when you've got a couple guys arriving from this freshman class. And so that gives Elston an opportunity, and I think he's made the most of it. I think this coaching staff has really liked what they've seen out of him. He's a walk-on player, by the way. That's kind of the crux of what I'm talking about here, is that he's a walk-on who's producing really highly right now. He had 6 tackles and a pass breakup, and his pass breakup was a deep ball that was intended for Malcolm Johnson Jr. in the end zone. And it was sort of anybody's ball. Is 50-50. I mean, if the receiver boxes out and gets position, he would have hauled that in for a touchdown. But Elston had really good position, jumped at the right time, made a really good play, and just looked like a really high-level safety and a safety who's going to be able to produce for this team. So I wouldn't be surprised unless guys like Adreshun Miller, who's coming in from West Virginia, unless they, try to move him to safety, or unless one of these freshman safeties really just starts producing at a high level and turning into a high level player and developing along in the defense really highly in the fall. I wouldn't be surprised to see Elston play in the fall. It seems like right now he's that number 4 safety behind. It was, Smoke Monday and Tennyson obviously were the guys with the first team, the number 1 defense, and then Chris Thompson Jr., who's a sophomore, the former 4-star player out of Texas. We kind of knew he was going to be that number 3 safety. We thought he was going to be a starter until they moved, obviously, Ladarius Tennyson back to safety. He's the number 3 guy. He actually had a really good game, too. I thought it was funny. he was commenting on the team's highlight video on Instagram, asking to post defensive highlights because, again, there were like good tackles by him, good plays made in space by the defense that obviously aren't going to make the highlight reel, but he's the number 3 safety. And then you've got Elston. So good play overall by the defense. The team Tigers only had 122 total yards. And again, I don't think they really would have scored unless they were put into that 2-minute situation before the half like they were. We had a lot of other quarterbacks see the field. Let's see. In total, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 quarterbacks, including Bo Nix. Grant Loy is the backup quarterback right now, but I think if this game showed anything, even if you didn't like Bo Nix's performance that much, which again, I would encourage you to go back and look, and it was a little bit more apparent that he was making the right decisions. And I think there was a lot of miscommunication in the passing game, which was to be expected. And obviously the defense is going to be ahead of the offense in these types of games. I think more than anything, this spring game showed that there's a very, very wide gap for anyone who had any sort of doubts about Bo Nix's starting job and whether he should be the starter. And that's a question, I've been asked this offseason with Demetrius Davis coming in. I just don't really think that's a valid question. I think the gap between Bo Nix and whoever ends up being his backup is very wide, very, very wide, just because Grant Loy playing against that first team defense really could do nothing. He went 4 of 12 for 29 yards. Again, not necessarily fair. He was playing behind the second team offensive line and, playing with second team guys. Devin Barrett and Jay Sharp were his running backs out of the backfield. But he really wasn't able to get much going. Demetrius Davis had a few nice plays. He had probably the most exciting play of the day that was not a touchdown, is a 48-yard completion down the sideline to Malcolm Johnson Jr. Really, really good ball by the freshman quarterback out of Houston. Stood in there, stepped up, and made the throw down the right sideline. Really, really good throw and catch for him. That second team offensive line, by the way, because there was no Alec Jackson, Killian Zaire the former JUCO product, a guy out of Germany, was playing at left tackle. He's completely healthy now, which is really nice to see after that leg injury last year. Tate Johnson was at left guard. Jaleel Irvin was at center. Cam Stutz was at right guard, and Brendan Coffey was at right tackle. I will note that Brendan Coffey checked in about midway through the game, little over midway through the game, checked in for Brodarius Ham at right tackle. Not a surprise. He and Troxel at left and right tackle, respectively, have been doing that all spring. Obviously, Troxel was able to get the start because Alec Jackson was not present at the spring game, and then Coffey kind of did what he was supposed to do and rotated in there like he has been doing all spring. But that was your immediate second team offensive line. Obviously, I think Troxel is your second team left tackle, and Zaire only got that opportunity because Jackson wasn't playing. Tate Johnson and Cam Stutz are guys, look, watching them, they played really well. I thought the left guard and the right guard on the second team, they rotated in a little bit with the first teamers this spring. They really impressed Will Friend and a lot of their teammates. I mean, we had multiple guys along the offensive line, just kind of unprompted, bring up both those names, Tate Johnson and Cam Stutz, as guys who have really come along this spring, both young players who might have an opportunity to help this offensive line this season if you get injuries or something like that. So I think they're pretty set at the top, and they obviously have 8 players from last year who started games, and you're going to get Brandon Council back in the fall. But, you know, if anything goes haywire, or these guys maybe make a really big step, but it's always good to have depth there. And the guys in front of them aren't going to be there forever. A lot of them are going to be gone after this season. So when they are, it looks like you're going to have good depth behind them. So we'll get into a little bit more. I got a few other things I want to touch on from the game. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. You are listening to the Auburn Undercover podcast. And we're back here on the Auburn Undercover podcast. So looking at the second half here, there was a running clock, I think, kind of toward the end of the third quarter. And then at the beginning of the fourth quarter, things really flew by in the second half. Things really moved quickly. Actually, I'm not sure if they really had a running clock. I think they just kind of let things go. You know what I'm saying? The officials and the coaching staff sort of let things play out and weren't really taking a lot of time. The end of the game, there were a lot of timeouts as they were trying to move the second team offense down the field. But there were some impressive plays there in the second half. I mentioned Demetrius Davis. He had a play where he juked the life out of Zacoby McClain in the open field. Demetrius Davis was in for the second team offense, running the second team offense at quarterback, made a really, really nice cut. You could see his athleticism. So he was a guy that, was kind of known for that. He was kind of a Lamar Jackson type runner out of high school at North Shore in Houston. And I kind of think, based on what we saw today and based on how he's progressed throughout the spring, because he's kind of figuring out the offense pretty well. His dad told me earlier in the spring that they actually went under center a lot at North Shore. And so I did notice that he seemed pretty comfortable doing that. The offense went under center, obviously a good bit in A-Day. They're going to do that more this season under Mike Bobo. Bobo admitted the quarterbacks have had trouble with it. You know, he'd be surprised if they hadn't. But it's come a little bit more natural to Demetrius Davis. That's not any reason to win a depth chart spot and beat over Grant Loy, like I think he's going to do. I just kind of get the feeling that, and most people kind of thought this, that you kind of saw his talent level on display at A-Day as 2, 3, 4 individual plays. Obviously, everything else was pretty stale, but that's just because it's a lot more difficult, again, for the offense to have things come along, and especially if you're an early enrollee freshman. But there were 2 or 3 or 4 plays where you really were just kind of like, okay, I can see where that guy's talent level's at, and I can see why he was a player that was so highly sought after, and you can see kind of that high school skill set that he had. That was a big play there in the second half that I thought was impressive. Lee Hunter probably made one of the best defensive plays of the game. The first team offense was driving, and they stopped them cold near midfield. The second team defense stopped them cold. Lee Hunter, the freshman out of Blunt, Alabama, Blunt County, dragged down Tank Bigsby in the backfield. Not Blunt County, Blunt High School near Mobile. Dragged down Tank Bigsby like in the backfield. Made a really, really good play, kind of busting through. And that kind of brings me to another point, talking about another guy along the defensive line. Obviously, one of the big storylines, if not the biggest storyline in terms of a position change this spring, has been JJ Pegues, the 300-pound tight end, moving from tight end to defensive line. You could see where there was a lot of work for him in this game. I thought there were a lot of negative reps for him where he didn't necessarily do anything wrong, but it was just kind of he was negated from the play pretty easily. Obviously, again, working with the second team defense against the starting offense, but there were a lot of plays that just kind of went right past him and he wasn't able to do much about it. He's only been at the position for 2 weeks. Auburn thinks very highly of his ability to contribute there. He's really enjoying it and has liked the switch so far. Nick Eason, Auburn's new defensive line coach, who came over from the NFL and the Cincinnati Bengals, has been really pleased with his attitude about the position change and is really excited. He's been giving him lots of tips, and that relationship has gone really well so far. But I will just say that this was kind of, a brief reality check to say, all right, it's going to take a little bit of time for him to get super comfortable with that and become sort of a full-fledged player at that position. But again, would not be surprised if he files in there in the fall and is able to get that down and become a productive player there. Moving on to the fourth quarter, a couple more notable plays, 2 good pass breakups. I thought that Chandler Wooten, so 2 pass breakups on fourth down. Chandler Wooten for the second team defense, obviously senior linebacker who is back after opting out last season. Got to talk to him during spring camp and thought he was really fun to talk to about his perspective of last year and becoming a father and his perspective on opting out and watching the team from a distance, that kind of stuff. Really, really good stuff from him. But anyway, he made a really good play, sort of coming over the middle from his linebacker spot. We've seen that from him. I think Auburn needs that coverage, and I think Derek Mason is really excited to have a guy with him, like with his frame at 6'3", really, really good sized linebacker to sort of play that, be an inside backer, but sort of play that roaming role, because we've seen that from him in the past. That's how he made that interception against Arkansas on that fake punt a couple years ago. And we've seen him make plays like that in space. I think he's pretty talented against the short passing game. So, I mean, that's a lot to take away from just one pass breakup on a spring game, but it was an impressive play by him and something definitely worth noting. And then Eric Reed Jr., who's a second-year player, former 4-star defensive back, he had another play that was almost mirrored the play by Trey Elston. It was a 4th and 1, and Auburn decided to launch it into the end zone. I can't remember who the quarterback was. It might have still been Bo Nix for that first-team offense, but he was with the second-team defense. He's playing corner now. He sort of came in and was molded to be a safety and kind of looked like signed to be a safety, and they thought he was going to play safety, but he's playing corner this spring, and I'm not entirely sure the receiver he was going up against, but just sort of a really good play in the back of the end zone, making a box out, getting in there and making the pass breakup. So good for him and a good play by him. I thought he had a pretty strong day. Another guy who sort of caught my eye was Kamal Haddon, who is the JUCO transfer, a guy who's an early enrollee. You've sort of seen the energy from him all spring in the opportunities we've had to view practice. He's a guy with a motor that just does not stop, a guy that you can definitely tell enjoys being out there on the field. Just a really, really high energy guy, definitely a talker, definitely a trash talker, which is exactly what you want most of the time at cornerback. He had a pretty good game. I thought he had a couple good breakups. And some of his teammates on defense were really high on his abilities after the game. Smoke Monday said that he's a guy that we should be looking out for. People following Auburn fans should be paying attention to moving into the fall, because he thinks he has a good opportunity to make some impact in the secondary at the cornerback spot in the fall and moving into the season, which is pretty high praise and it's pretty big, because this is a really, really deep and talented cornerback rotation. And I'm not sure people necessarily thought a guy like Kamal Haddon was going to beat out other guys and get a ton of playing time, especially with Drayshawn Miller, the transfer from West Virginia, coming in. So I think Monday is exactly on the money, and I think that Haddon will have a good chance to contribute in the fall. The other MVP I did not mention was Anders Carlson. I believe this is the 7th straight year that a Carlson brother has won MVP. Obviously, next year is going to be the first year for them without a kicker, but they've got some good options on the recruiting trail. They're in a pretty good spot for the number 1 kicker in the country. But Anders Carlson hit 2 field goals. I will say, just to be completely transparent, I voted for Oscar Chapman. He had 3 punts and an average of 42 yards, including one that went for 54 yards, which is really impressive, and he pinned one inside the 20-yard line. So, I mean, I thought that was a really good mark for him. And Carlson's 2 field goals, they were from 28 yards and 34 yards. Obviously, he's very good. I think he can be a really, really good weapon for Auburn this year. Not that he hasn't been over the past few years, because really midway through the 2019 season is when it just sort of clicked for him. He got out of that funk, and he really has never gotten back into it. I think he can be really, really good. Philip wrote last week in the For Your Eyes Only piece here at Auburn Undercover, sort of the notebook on the status of the program and sort of some insider notes. He wrote that this coaching staff thinks that Anders Carlson can be an All-American. He has had that kind of a spring. I think you can probably count on one hand, just based from what I've heard, you can count on one hand the amount of kicks he's missed this entire spring. And they're testing his limits and pushing him way back. In warmups, he was really, really impressive. We're talking hitting 60-yard kicks, stuff like that. So he's a guy who has worked on his craft and has developed his leg every offseason he's had with this team. And you can see that power every year when he comes back after the offseason. Not necessarily the accuracy until midway through, I guess that would be his sophomore year. Really, things started to click. Last year, he was 20 for 22. He had the same accuracy rate on field goals of 40-plus yards as Jose Borregales, who won the the kicker award. I'm blanking on the name of the kicker, the Groza, the guy who won the Groza. Anders had the same field goal percentage as him and the same percentage on long field goals as the guy from Miami who won the award. So I thought Anders Carlson, this is just kind of, again, an aside, a little bit of a tangent talking about him winning MVP, but I thought he was a bit of an underrated piece for Auburn last season. Obviously, he had the game-winning field goal against Arkansas, which, I mean, only came because he missed the field goal beforehand, but he didn't miss many kicks last year. He only missed 2 of them. And again, they think he can be a really high-level player. He was voted first-team All-SEC last season. I think he can replicate that. I think he can be even better. He's obviously not going to be Daniel Carlson. He's not going to be the SEC leading scorer all time just because he's not able to to make up that ground that quickly, although he could take an extra season and be a super senior. But I think he's got NFL aspirations. And again, this is just kind of an observation from being at the game and listening to people throughout the spring, is that I think he is going to be a very, very big weapon for this team in the fall. So that's pretty much all I've got going through my notes here. There were 15 drives on the game. Again, 6 different quarterbacks played. I thought Bo Nix easily was the most impressive. Demetrius Davis probably had the most impressive individual plays. I thought he made 2 or 3 plays that really showed off his athleticism. You had Tank Bigsby as the MVP. Sean Shivers, I mean, obviously ran really hard. You never don't see that out of him. He had 12 carries. He had the most carries of the game. 12 carries for 55 yards. His longest run, he had a 12-yard run in the first half where he was breaking tackles on the sideline. Thought that was really impressive. We've come to expect that out of him. Devin Barrett was the number 3 running back, the guy who has moved over from defensive back to his original position. Jay Sharp was the number 4 running back, the walk-on out of Pinson Valley, who's had a pretty productive spring. Just kind of looking at the stats here, trying to see if I missed anything. Nope. Think we're all good here. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of go through and talk about the observations from the game and what they mean for the fall. Again, Auburn has one more practice on Monday to go through to make up for that day that they lost because of weather earlier this spring. And then they're done and they don't come back till June. Obviously the NCAA has lifted the recruiting dead period. This is something I wanted to note. June 1st, the recruiting dead period is going to be up, and they're going to be allowed to have official visitors on campus. Brian Harsin was asked after the game what the team's COVID plans are for right now in terms of, just vaccinations. Are they going to offer vaccines to everybody on the team? And that's, a pretty important question, talking about, it's very topical right now. We're wondering whether that's going to be something they're going to try to do for all of college football in order to get guys as protected as possible. And Harsin said that he's had conversations with other head coaches and Auburn's administrators and higher ups, obviously, trying to get things figured out. And he basically said that June 1st date is very important right now for them. Kind of looking at that, wanting to make sure that they have something in place where people who come on campus June 1st, families who come on campus, recruits who come on campus, that they're going to feel safe and comfortable because of the way Auburn is protected. So he didn't really spell it out that plainly, but it's sort of insinuating that is kind of a target date that's going to be really key for them in terms of their timeline for getting a plan like that figured out. He said some of the coaching staff is vaccinated, not all of them. Didn't say anything about the players. I know some of the players are, and then obviously some aren't. So that's something that they're working on. He said every day he's having a conversation with somebody about that. So again, hopefully that's something that will get in the works very soon, and that players will have an opportunity to have that, because things were very encouraging. Again, second biggest crowd of the weekend. They were able to up the stadium capacity to 40%. Maybe that number can get pushed up and up and up over the next few months, and we can get closer to a full stadium in the fall, because that's what a lot of players talked about after the game, is that this was the biggest crowd they've played in front of since the 2019 Iron Bowl, which was pretty crazy. So if you can continue to push that number up, obviously all the players do miss that home field advantage. And if it can be done safely, which it looks like, we're in a position where things can start to be done more safely. That's really exciting. So that's it. 2021 A-Day game is in the books now. June will be the summer workout period. And then after that, it's on to fall camp. And the first football season of the Brian Harsin era starts September 4th against Akron. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the Auburn Undercover podcast. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts. We are back on Spotify. Shoot me a message if this podcast does not show up somewhere that you like to listen to podcasts, because I can go in and make that happen. I can go in and add it. I believe I was able to do that. So leave us a 5-star review if you liked it. I promise that is the number one thing that helps out. If you did not like it, shoot me a message. Let me know what we need to improve on. The intro and outro music is by my good buddy Beats by Mordecai. You can find him on SoundCloud, Twitter, and Instagram. And we will see you guys later. Everybody have a good week, and thank you for listening.